Content warning. This story includes themes of sexual violence and poisoning. I will not describe assaults in graphic detail. The focus is on their consequences and the choices they force. She found her daughter folded into shadow before the corn store, a thin shape shivering where the sacks made a dark shelter. Benedita's skirt hung wrong. Her hands trembled as if from cold that no fire could answer. There was no need for questions. The look in her eyes said what words could not bear. Rosa, who had been the kitchen of Santa Rita for longer than any living white face on the plantation, held her daughter with a steadiness that masked the shaking inside her chest. She listened to the small, uneven breath and read the bruise of silence as one reads an old ledger. Numbers that add up to ruin. This was 1847, and the larger world, men in distant halls, kept a language of law that did nothing in the dirt and sweat of a fazenda. The house of Señor Candido sat high, wooden steps polished by unwitting feet. The veranda offered a view of Cain and the horizon. Inside, the Casa Grande was a theatre of manners where appearances were kept and where cruelty was either a private sin or an untouchable law. Below, the Senzala, where families were named by the day they ate and the work they gave, held the other measures, trust, fear, the small cruelties that would not be recorded. Rosa had been a fixture in that liminal place between sustenance and secrecy. She rose with the first blue light to stoke the hearth, to put pulses and cassava into long boiling, to coax flavor out of meager things so the household could feel itself affluent. Hands that could beat dough into bread could also squeeze the life from a fruit if taught by necessity. It was knowledge kept in the palms of those who labored unseen. And Benedita, Rosa's daughter, had learned at her mother's side. She learned which herbs mended a fever, which song to hum when the bread came out too dark, how a hand can steady a trembling wrist. She had also learned a dangerous thing, the secret reading Father Tomé taught her when the overseer's back was turned, letters that opened the world in Benedita's head, making her both brighter and more vulnerable. Augusto arrived back at Santa Rita with a suit of civility. He had been away for a time. Rumors said the city had taught him manners, and he returned to the veranda with a polite smile and pockets that jingled like a reed basket full of promises. For visitors and neighbors he could speak of commerce and the weather, of horses and the future of the plantation. For the enslaved his greeting had a colder interior, a tilt of the head that said this house and the bodies within it belonged to him as inheritance. The politeness of the city papered over a cruelty that did not need loud speech. It showed through small humiliations, a tightening leash. At first the insults were private. Augusto would summon Benedita under some pretext, a chore to be done poorly, and punishments would follow that were explained away as discipline. Then the punishments became worse, not with words that a magistrate could put to paper and punish, but with uses of power that left scars in the way a person held themselves afterward. Rosa learned to watch the way Benedita walked, how her mouth closed at meals, how her laughter stopped mid-strain. She learned to become spectacles of calm while tending the pot, to press bread into Benedita's hands and whisper only the single word that would steady: hide. Rosa made small shelters. She sent Benedita to gather kindling on errands that took her near the river where the underbrush could hide a face. She taught her to fold her skirt over a wound so that a passerby would not see what inside she tried to keep from breaking. But when power is absolute, the little strategies become fragile things. The Casa Grande is a net, a slight tug, and everything you dangle comes closer to being seen. Rosa tried once to speak to Mariana, the mulher who kept the veranda's etiquette and whose dresses never frayed. She asked for a light, some letter of protection, some intercession from the mistress who presided over linens and instructing of the daughters of the house. Mariana listened, her fingers folding and unfolding a handkerchief. Her face, trained in the art of domestic command, was the perfect mask of concern. She said the right phrases, "We shall consider," and then turned back to the music of the salon. Señor Candido, when approached, shifted on his chair and spoke of farm business he could not be interrupted for. He did not look at the trembling hands that had prepared his meals, because to look would be to see responsibility. Silence lives best when the high sit polite and the low make do. Inside the Senzala, the reaction was different. There was an undercurrent of knowledge no one spoke aloud. Tia Quiteria, lonely to some, revered to others, kept a reserve of remedies pressed between the pages of her life. Old Pai Tome taught boys and girls to shape letters with a twig and a pool of rain. Joachim and Tobias shared their food and their rage in the quiet hours. They all knew something of the world's injustices, and some of them had learned to pray or to curse in the same breath. But the plantation's law was not the kind that spoke in courtrooms. It was enforced by weapons, by contracts, by the look of a man like Augusto when he decided to take. Benedita's decline was a slow erosion. It was not a single publicized moment that could be written up. It was nights of fever, of silent weeping, of a woman whose shoulders tightened into a smaller shape. Once, Dr. Mendonça was called, a physician whose skill lay in tending symptoms that aligned with the comforts of the house. He felt the pulse and called it a fever of the impoverished blood, an ailment explained by the ordinary harshness of the tropics. There were tinctures, a poultice, a boiled herb rubbed on the temples. Benedita grew thinner. Her bright moments came more rarely, and when they did, she would ask for a scrap of paper and trace letters, like a promise. The last clear day of Benedita's speech was small and sharp as a coin. She took Rosa's hand and laced their fingers like a secret knot. "Promise me," she whispered. She did not say in what words or to whom the promise must be kept. She only said, "Promise." Rosa felt the syllables land and knew what they meant, an unnameable vow made of fury and sorrow. She promised, and in the promise, something shifted. The house that had once been a place for pots and orders became, for Rosa, a map. The kitchen was no longer simply a room of work. It was a workshop and a library. It was a place where knowledge of roots and barks and the unspoken language of cooking could become another kind of power. Rosa's anger was not loud. She moved through her grief methodically, as she always had through the long turning and knead dough. She began to watch what was done with food. How August did not like his soup too thick, how he preferred the broth warm but not hot, how he tipped the bowl to the last drop in the exact manner of a man who had practiced this small ritual until it was part of his breath. She learned that his evenings were predictable. After supper, a short walk on the veranda, a cigar, and then a room where no one entered unless summoned. The household's rhythms were a scaffold of habits, the exact hour when the bell called the table, the way the butler poured, the time the lamp was extinguished. Rosa drew these habits together like thread, but habits alone do not settle a heart. Rosa needed means. She went to Tia Quiteria not with a shout, but with the measured step of someone who knew how favors are paid. Quiteria lived at the edge of the plantation's wild, in a small lean-to shaded by a fig tree. She kept, like any old woman who had survived and seen much, a knowledge of plants that the medicine men from town had never asked how she learned. Her hands were bones, wrapped in patience. Rosa watched her work with a bowl and a pestle, and felt the remembered hum of the kitchen change into a different kind of lesson. Tia Quiteria spoke in the low tone of someone who remembers what is dangerous. She named things Rosa already half knew: mandioca brava, bitter cassava, whose juice, if extracted and concentrated, brought on pain that a physician might mistake for sudden disease. She spoke of how to leach it, how to press and discard and press again until the bitter turned to a poison of subtlety. She warned Rosa of time, how long it would act, what to watch for in a human body. She would not glorify such knowledge. She spoke of it like a person balancing a weight. They tested on what could be risked and what could not. In the small privacy of Quiteria's shadow, Rosa watched a rat take a tiny amount of the concentrate. It convulsed and slept in a way that was not like the harm of a stick, but like a sudden shutting. Rosa held her hand in the bowl steam and felt her heart beat against the cold of the remedy. The animal's suffering was a thing to mark and contain. They only used what the old woman deemed necessary and nothing more. To learn eyes and timing, Rosa measured and timed and wrote it, carving notes into the back of an old account book. She would not let her own hand be the only ledger. The more she learned, the more precise she became. Work in the kitchen is repetition. A person who tends flame and salt is trained in measures and in patience. Rosa learned how to concentrate the juice so that it left no odor, how heat could mask scent, how a soup's grease would hide bitterness when the broth was right. She learned that sugar could be a veil, that a man used to the bowl of his favorite could be deceived by small changes. She was methodical. She tasted a spoonful of broth, feeling nothing, then another that had a trace and feeling a bitter backwash. She changed nothing at the table that would betray the hand that had altered it. There was also, quietly, a catalogue of wrongs she kept. Rosa did not make this a public ledger. She kept slivers of memory in the same place she kept recipes, ingredients stacked with grudges. There were the nights she had stood outside the closed door and heard Benedita's small sobs. The day Augusto slapped a servant for a bowl not hot enough. The times Senor Candido looked away so that he could sleep without interference. Mariana's hand that smoothed a table but could not smooth a life. These things pressed into her like weight. They made a kind of calculus, pain against impunity. It is tempting to imagine that such a path, one from grief to planned vengeance, happens overnight. It does not. Rosa's planning took months. She practiced patience like a recipe that must rest. She kept her work at the stove and her face serene to those who watched. She taught Benedita to lay cloths, to wash cutlery, to set out bowls. She watched the butler bring in a favored soup for Augusto on certain nights, the way the air would scald his lips and comment on the gentleness of a broth. She took notes on the calendar of small things: the day the overseer fell ill and did not come to the table, the week the hacienda was busier and guests arrived, the moment when Senor Candido decided to visit the town, and the house would have less overseer presence. Silence is a currency, and Rosa bartered with it. She told no one of her full intention. She hinted like smoke to some, an old woman with knowledge, a sorrow that steeled her. Joachim and Tobias saw the change in her, but they were cautious. Their survival taught them the same restraint. To admit to plotting was to invite a punishment that would be measured not by law, but by the whim of those with power. Even Tia Quiteria, who knew more than most, kept her mouth small. She had seen too many things unspoken leave tongues as black with fear. Rosa's experiments became quieter. She hid the small bottles under flour sacks, wrapped them in cloth that smelled of cassava to fool any nosing nose. She would watch a pot simmer and think of the day she would bring it to a man who thought himself sovereign. In the domestic movements, the stirring, the skimming, the setting of the table, she practiced the choreography that would pass as normal. She knew that a cook who moves slowly and precisely is invisible in a house that prizes speed and taste. Her hand would lift a ladle with the same casual grace she always displayed, and inside it had learned to carry a will. If there was one thing that sustained her, it was Benedita's last breath of request. It was a small command that could not be given to the law, only answered by what another hand could do. There are moments when a person promises, and the promise changes the shape of their days. Rosa's promise to Benedita was not a mantra of righteous vengeance. It was a private covenant, a folding of two griefs into one possible remedy. She did not say that killing Augusto would heal the house. She said simply that she would not let him harm again. The house, for all its measured politeness, had its routines of suspicion. If a gentleman died suddenly, the explanation of the household was always quick: a fever, a stroke, a sudden cholera. Dr. Mendonca's vocabulary suited the Casa Grande. The doctor could dress a death in words that kept servants' hands off the truth. There was utility in that vocabulary for Rosa. If a poison could replicate the abruptness of a disease, the household would accept it. People prefer coherent stories to inconvenient puzzles. But to make a death look like disease required more than chemistry. It required timing and the illusion of normalcy. Rosa planned around rituals. She mapped the way Augusto liked his soup in the small hours. The bowl placed at the center of a worn cloth, the spoon used in a particular sweep. She observed how Senor Candido would sometimes eat later, how Mariana might join or not, and how the butler would never come into the kitchen while a pot still smoked. She found, in the repetitions of the house, a window, a night when Senor Candido would travel to the town, when the doors would be fewer, the attention more scattered. Her preparations included mundane details: a repaired ladle, a warmed bowl set upon a polished tray, a folded napkin that would not look out of place. She practiced the angle at which a servant might tilt a bowl so as to remove the last drops to the edge. the motion of a hand that was not tremulous but assured. Each rehearsal was a small whisper of normal. If she had to hide grief beneath workmanship, she would make the workmanship impeccable. There were nights when doubt visited in the long hours by the stove. Rosa would sit with a cup of bitter coffee and think of Benedita's hair, the way it smelled after rain. She would picture the faces of the children in the senzala who would step into the world knowing they were worth less than a ledger. She would wonder not about the mechanics of the plan, but about the cost. Revenge, once enacted, cannot be taken back. It does not mend the bone of a girl who went silent. It does not erase the way laughter left the house. It does, however, change the balance. It sets a new precedent within a place where precedent had always favored the powerful. One evening in the lee of a moon, Tia Quiteria and Rosa performed a final extract. The kitchen carried the hum of night work. The mortar, a steady hand pressing and squeezing, the filtered juice running into a blackened basin. They boiled and cooled, poured and strained. The concentrate took on a thickness like syrup, darker than tea, without a scent that would alarm a passer-by. The old woman measured 3 spoonfuls into a small jar and handed it to Rosa, with a look like a blessing and a warning all tangled together. "You will not be hasty," Quiteria told her. "This weight will be yours to hold." Rosa wrapped the jar in a cloth and slid it into the hollow beneath her apron next to a rag she used for polishing spoons. She walked back to the Casa Grande, as if she were returning to set a table, as if the air had not altered between each breath. The white-gloved servants nodded at her. No one saw the small clothed jar tucked close to her heart. There was one more thing she needed: witness. Not a witness who would speak in court and scare the house, for courts are distant things, slow and partial, but a witness who could hold the secret and not fold. Rosa went to Quiteria and laid out the account. The old woman sat in the half-light and listened, knowing how often silence preserved life. "If they ask," Quiteria said, "we keep the lid closed. We bury it between ourselves." They spoke the pact in low tones. There was no ceremony, only a shared understanding that some knowledge must not see daylight. It was not bravado, it was survival. The only law stronger than the Plantation's was the compact among those without power to keep its own counsel. Rosa began to finalize the map. She wrote no formal plan. Her record was a list turned into muscle memory. The days when the house received guests were out. The nights when Señor Candido returned unexpectedly were noted and avoided. She timed the speed at which the butler served, the way the oil lamp burned down. She rehearsed walking with a tray as if in a procession of service. There is a kind of armor in preparation, a stiffness to the shoulder that tells a person they have anticipated the world's cruelty and can therefore move within it. As the seasons shifted, so did the small necessities. Benedita's body grew thinner and then even smaller. There were times Rosa felt as though everything she had learned to do, knead, stir, tend, was now a ritual of memory rather than life. She maintained her patterns because attention hides the mind from suspicion, because the best mask is a face that has been practiced for years. Her hands remained steady. The household never suspected that the woman who ladled soup with exactitude harbored a plan heavy enough to topple a man as high as Augusto. The day before she meant to act, or at least the day she had circled in her mind for a long time, Rosa moved with a rhythm that was both ordinary and precise. She rose when the sky was still the color of old silver, tilled fire in the hearth, and set her pots to the boil. She peeled cassava with the practiced speed of decades. The bitter root, mandioca brava, smelled of the earth, of starch and sun, and she worked it until her fingers learned to know the exact moment to press. She thought of Benedita every time the knife struck, and the grief steadied rather than slowed her. There was a professionalism in the grief, a kind of allegiance. That night, she laid out the bowl she had scrubbed until the shine was perfect. She ladled the soup and added the small measured spoons of the concentrate, stirring until there was no taste but the taste the house expected. Her hand trembled once, and she steadied it against the rim. She wrapped the jar, but she did not yet bring the bowl up the stairs. She paused at the doorway between the kitchen and the servants' corridor and listened to the soft creak of the house settling. Somewhere above, the lamp flickered. The sound of men's laughter drifted down and away, far and cushioned by distance. The butler called for the table. The bell that summoned them to the meal chimed with that same measured tone the house prized. Rosa breathed and felt the plan fold into motion. She thought of Benedita's last whisper. She thought of the way silence protected those who had no other refuge. She thought finally of what comes after. The act would not return what had been taken. It would rearrange the world in a way that might make things harder for those who remained. It would not be a cure. It would be an answer made of the only tools she had been given: patience, kitchencraft, a reserve of botanical knowledge no one had thought worth crediting. If this story matters to you, please subscribe and keep these names Rosa, Benedita, Tia Quiteria in mind. Remembering is the smallest justice we can offer when courts offer none. The night tightened. Rosa wrapped the tray in a cloth that smelled of cassava and bread. She walked past the quarters where children slept, curled against one another like shells, past the place where Joachim snored, past the low glow where Tobias sat mending a net. Each face in the corridor looked up and away, not seeing the rim of the tray. She climbed the stairs and paused for a breath at the doorway of the sala. Voices floated, the rustle of a fan, the clink of a glass. Augusto laughed, the sort of laugh meant to reassert place. For a moment, everything held its breath with her. Then she stepped into the room, head bent, posture as if to apologize for the intrusion of a servant who had brought the simple satisfaction of his supper. She set the bowl in front of him with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He did not look up as she left. He did not see the small cloth her hand brushed on the rim. She retreated down the stairs as if to the usual service of cleaning plates, her face smooth, her heart a closed fist. Behind closed doors, a man who had believed himself untouchable sipped from a bowl he had expected to taste like every other night. Moments later there was a sound, an incoherent, involuntary noise that is a human body's protest when it is betrayed. Rosa kept scrubbing. She wiped the pot until the iron light of it shone, and the cloth under her palm became a metronome. From above came the thud and the voice that asked for a doctor. Men ran and lanterns clattered. The doctor came with measured explanation. He found a pulse that fluttered and then faltered. He said, in words that favored the house's sense of order, that it might be a sudden sickness, perhaps a fever, perhaps an old predisposition. No one, not even those who stood most to gain from asking, thought to put a suspicion in the mouth of the household. Here the assumption was that misfortune visited like the weather and could not be traced to a measured hand. Rosa moved through the next hours like smoke. She placed clean bowls on a table, offered a slice of sweet bread to the distraught mistress, and listened to condolences that were made for the rich. She felt no triumph. The scale within her had shifted. It had been weighed down by grief and now balanced on something heavier. The house mourned and made declarations that embraced the language of fate. The death was announced, and tongues spoke of providence. Some faces wore relief like a light that could not be seen otherwise. But there was one person to whom the secret would soon be offered, and she sought her in the quiet hours. Tia Quiteria came at midnight with a shawl around her shoulders. She looked at Rosa and read in her face the tremor of weight already borne. They spoke without a sound enough to be heard down the corridor. Quiteria nodded once and, without question, placed her hands on Rosa's palms. "We bury this between us," she said. "The pact sealed as simply as tying a frayed rope." Rosa felt the secret settle into her bones, with a finality that made her both lighter and lonelier. Later, the household would speak in the ways of the well-off, about fate and sudden illnesses, about God and destiny, about a man lost before his time. No magistrate would demand answers that the house could not give. No court would unmask the insides of a family that protected its own. The layers of polite language, so practiced on the veranda, would fold down over the truth and smother it. For now, in this narrow span, Rosa walked the quarters as if nothing had shifted. She arranged Benedita's small things in an act that was almost tenderness, almost penitence, and placed them in a box. She did not tell anyone that she had kept a shard of a bowl, or that she had added a sprig of herb to the box, so that the memory would have the bruise of scent it deserved. She moved through the day with the steadiness of someone who has done what was needed, and who must now live with the result. There were questions she did not let herself ask aloud. Would another man take the place of one who had been removed? Would the household adapt and continue to allow cruelty in other forms? These thoughts lay like seeds in a field. She knew only that one life had been ended, and that the ending did not remake the past. She had not acted with a court behind her. She had acted because the court had never been offered. There is a reckoning that comes from being its own judge. It is not the pure light of righteousness. It is the dull burn of a wound's medicine. That night, when the lamps were low and the house sighed itself to sleep, Rosa sat alone at the back of the kitchen. The embers glowed. She felt the presence of Benedita in all the small things. Her towel still folded like a small flag, a sketch of letters torn from a page. She breathed in the faint smell of cassava and thought of the line she had crossed. The kitchen held the quiet of work finished, but not undone. The pots cooled, and the ash settled like the calm after a storm. She did not confess. Confession is a thing that seeks absolution from a structure that had never defended the weak. Instead, she kept the secret like a stone in her pocket. It warmed her, and it weighed her. In daylight, she would rise and cook as always. She would ladle soup and stand with her arm steady, and present the table with an ease the house expected. She would accept people's condolences, hear them speak of fate, and answer with the same phrases the household practiced. But at night, she would remember the pale face of her daughter, and the promise that had turned into a plan. The price remained unspoken. The next days would see the household adjusting. Flowers set in the sala, a memorial phrase learned and repeated, the short span of mourning observed with the precision of the privileged. Servants would continue their tasks under new orders. Tensions that had been hidden under the veneer of order would rearrange themselves into new forms. For Rosa, the work of living with her act was only beginning. She had performed what no court had done. Yet the act lived in a space where it would not be explained away. The truth was a small ember. Outside, the plantation moved in its slow, cruel rhythm, indifferent to the ripples emanating from the Casa Grande. The field hands swung machetes according to seasons. Children chased each other in dust. Old men sat and told half-stories that left out the names that would change a life. The world continued to be as it always was, unless one looked closely at the places where grief had spoken and been answered in a name like Rosa. There would be consequences that could not be foreseen by a woman who had acted from the tightness of grief. There would be whispers and suspicions, and perhaps a rumor that could not be suppressed. There would be terror and grief in descendants, and the way the house would cover its tracks would carve a new layer of silence. For now, Rosa tended her tasks and kept the secret within the flannel of routine. She moved through days as if the plate she had set down did not also hold a breaking point in the world's structure. As the night gave way to a new dawn that smelled of embers and cassava, Rosa folded a cloth and set it in the drawer where the family kept clean linens. She smoothed it with a hand that had known both healing and harm. The kitchen hummed. The memory of Benedita's whisper glowed like coal beneath the touch of her palm. She would not be the last to carry this kind of wound. The plantation had made such wounds ordinary. But in the space where the law failed, people like Rosa learned, for better or worse, how to answer. The story does not end with a single act. It branches and ripples and presses inward toward those who must decide how to remember and how to name the cost. For Rosa, the path she chose would require more than a single night of courage. It would ask her to live in the shadow of her choice, to explain nothing and to endure everything. She had done what no court would do, not as an act of heroism, but as an utterance of a human heart denied other remedies. The rest of the tale waits in the ways the house bends, and the secrets keep their own counsel. The weeks after the funeral arrived like a slow season. The house resumed its rituals, each movement a stitch to cover the rent of grief. Flowers were arranged with a precision that made them look like an offering rather than a mistake. Candles burned in patterned ways so the light would not betray the cracks beneath the varnish. Servants wore a practiced gravity and returned to chores that supplied the household's muscle until the mind of the place could think again. Rosa moved within these hours as if she wore the shadow of that night like a cloak. She kept her hands busy. She cleaned, she kneaded, she measured, she mended. The domestic world offered a kind of shelter, tasks that required only steadiness, not explanation. People noticed her, sometimes with a glance sharpened by suspicion, sometimes with a look so ordinary it could be mistaken for indifference. In the corridors, whispers slid past like draughts. At the well, gossip pooled and then dried. A few voices, soft and low, hinted at questions. "Strange how sudden," someone would say. Another would shrug and name some natural cause, and the conversation would turn. There was never any formal inquiry. The house had everything that made such things unnecessary: control, appearances, and a vocabulary that dressed misfortune in providence. Dr. Mendonça, whose presence was sought in such moments, and whose hands were practiced in dressing illness with respectable terms, wrote what he had to write. He supplied the phrases needed: acute onset, unforeseen complication, the will of God. These were words that allowed the Casa Grande to close its shutters against prolonged questioning. People in the town accepted the story because such explanations eased their own proximity to a rupture they did not wish to claim. Within the Senzala, the silence was different. It hummed with knowledge that did not want to be voiced aloud. Joaquim and Tobias lingered at their tasks and threw their eyes to Rosa in ways that asked and answered in the same look. They had seen the way she had moved in the kitchen that night, watched hands that did more than stir a pot, and they had heard the small sounds that make one think of other things. But the law of survival taught them a more immediate grammar than accusation. Keep your head low. Keep the secret between those who had no other shield. Even among those who suspected, only a few could name the actual form of the remedy. Most called it a sickness the house had always called by other names. Rosa, for her part, lived in an economy of small rituals that kept her from being consumed by memory. She preserved Benedita's letters in a folded cloth, the thin scraps of handwriting on pages taught by Pai Tome, the secret reading teacher who had risked so much to carve letters into the children's imaginations. On certain mornings, she would take out those letters and read them as if pronouncing a kind of liturgy, the cadence of margin and ink offering her a momentary company. At night, she would sometimes dream of Benedita tracing letters in the dust, the movement of her small finger like a compass. She would wake with the taste of cassava in her mouth and the slow swirl of guilt and relief in her chest. Years passed in the way plantation years do. Season folded into season, rain into dry, harvests measured in the sound of machetes. The children who had once curled like shells in the servants' corridor grew, took on work, formed small families in the shadow of the fields. New faces arrived and learned the patterns of the place. Some remembered Benedita's brightness, others did not know the name that had been wiped from the ledger of the land. Memory there was porous, kept alive only by those who chose to carry it. In the Casa Grande, life leaned toward oblivion. Senor Candido buried grief under other losses: market prices, the weather, guests. He spoke of the future in the same way people who hold power do, strategically, as if time were a commodity to be arranged. Mariana continued to keep her linens immaculate and her gestures measured. The economy of appearances required no less. Rosa's presence in the kitchen became a kind of steady pulse. New servants learned the choreography she had long taught: where the spoons went, how the fire should be banked, which herbs calmed the stomach. She taught without speaking too much of that night. She taught as one passes on skill that is older than grief, and as careful as one who knows how easily knowledge attracts a question. Sometimes the young ones would ask after Benedita, and she would answer with a small story, a phrase, a taste memory, and then move on. The briefness of the responses kept the past from lodging in a place that might be pried open. There were moments when suspicion slid away, and was replaced by a kind of quiet reverence. Older women from neighboring fazendas would nod at Rosa in a way that meant, without using words, a recognition of what grief can make possible. They might not approve of the method. They might not condone it in any straightforward sense, but they understood the calculus, an absence of law pressed until the only options left were those held in a hand. Tia Quiteria carried the secret like a small stone too. She did not speak of it, not to authorities, not to friends who might repeat and thus endanger the small web. But she carried it in her gestures, a particular nod when Rosa passed by, a shawl folded and left on a bench as if in sympathy. Herbs passed quietly in an old tin. There was an elder's solidarity threaded through the two women's interactions. Quiteria, who had always been the repository of plant lore and of memory for the community, understood that some knowledge might be destructive if aired. She had seen too many times the way such truths are swallowed and then used to hurt further. When Tia Quiteria grew older, age pressed on her with the same steady hand as it did on everyone. People began to speak of her as if she were a lens through which the plantation's long memory could be read. She would sit in her lean-to and shell beans, telling a story that sometimes left out the names that might bring trouble. On one of those evenings, some years after the night that had changed everything, a young woman came to sit with her. Her hands were quick and her face eager for the use of knowledge. She asked about plants, about remedies. Quiteria, who had been given the choice of speech or silence more than once in her life, softened her voice and told a history that skirted the hard center. She spoke of bitter roots and of juices, and of the obligation to protect the small ones. On that night, she also did a thing she had refused before. She reached for Rosa's hand and held it as if compressing an old map. Her eyes, clouded with age but steady, looked at Rosa with a kind of companionable weight, and then turned toward the young woman. "We keep some things between us," she said. The phrase was not an admission in the public sense, nor was it an accusation. It was a handing over of understanding. She did not speak of Augusto by name. She did not instruct anyone to repeat what they already knew. But in that exchange there was a shaping of memory, a decision that the secret would not be used to self-justify, but rather to remember who had been wronged. There were consequences that were smaller and more intimate than the public reckoning a court might have offered. Rosa felt the reverberations in ways that no legal adjudication could cover. She had done what no court would do, and the cost was to live with the knowledge that her hands had altered fate. She found herself less able to join in the small pleasures of the kitchen's ordinary life. Laughter could come like a blade. A child's cry could wedge open the place where no light could pass. Once, when a boy under her care scraped his knee, she felt a small irrational hatred that surprised her, an unease that connected the wound with the taking she had made. Guilt and shame and a strange residue of power braided themselves in her heart. At times she considered speaking to Senor Candido, or to Mariana, or to those who had been able to shift the world's weight and had chosen not to. She thought about writing down what had happened in a ledger and leaving it in a place where it might be found one day by someone with the authority to name it. But she knew that courts served a world that saw her and people like her as objects rather than as subjects, as property to be accounted for, not as beings whose speech might be heard with justice. There was a practical logic to silence that she could not ignore. The silence was both a protection and a prison. Rosa's age advanced. Her fingers, always skilled in the handling of food and roots, began to carry the faint tremor of time. She found sometimes that the measure of salt slipped by smaller degrees. She had to lean her hand against the wood of the table to steady it. The work remained as ever a tether. People came and went. Births in the quarters replaced quiet deaths, and the ongoing life of labor continued. Children she had known as teenagers married and left, or moved to other properties or stayed. The circle tightened and loosened in rhythm with the seasons. When she grew ill herself in a winter that was not as severe as memory sometimes made it, a small entourage in the senzala gathered around her. Joaquim brought hot broth, Tobias held a cloth, Pai Tome recited a prayer he had taught in the quiet. Dr. Mendonça was again asked, though with a different tenor. The physician who once dressed a death with comfortable words now looked at Rosa with the uncertain respect afforded to someone who had pressed the household into a new order. He offered the usual remedies, fomentations, a bitter tea, rest. Rosa accepted them with the dignity of a person who knew the path to the end was not shaped by doctors alone. In the last days she spoke less and listened more. There were moments when the names of things rose into her mouth like fish toward the surface. Benedita, Tia Quiteria, the old mortar, and she would tell simple stories that went only as far as tenderness warranted. She asked to see the fig tree by Quiteria's lean-to one last time. She wanted to feel the shade where the two women had once ground roots and spoken of caution. Joaquim took her there at dusk, supporting her with an arm at the back. She rested beneath the branches and watched the way the sun made the leaves like small coins. She touched the bark with a hand that had held so much and said nothing for a long time. Tia Quiteria came on the day Rosa's breath seemed to draw shorter and less often. She brought a small bundle of herbs wrapped in a cloth and set it on the table. The old woman knelt and took Rosa's hand with both of hers. She did not ask about the past. She did not need to. The pact they had made lived in the bones of both of them like a thing that had been fed and tended. When Rosa's time came, it was quiet. There was no dramatic confession, no dramatic unburdening. Her last words, when she managed them, were a small list of things: a request that Benedita's letters be buried with her, a soft asking that someone plant cassava by the lean-to, a hope that the children in the quarters might learn to read and hold those letters, because knowledge, more than anything, had been Benedita's treasure. Those requests were honored in the modest way such requests are honored among those who share a life of scarcity, with care and the slow remedy of remembrance. Her burial was as she had planned, not in the veranda's neat plots, not with the house's marble plaques, but in the small ground behind the senzala, where the community kept its own dead. There were no stone markers, nothing to draw overseers' notice. Joachim, Tobias, Paitome, and Tia Quiteria carried the small wooden box. They dug with hands that had been used to tasks of planting and harvesting, and they set Rosa beside Benedita. A sprig of cassava was placed between their hands, a quiet token that stitched them together beyond the house's ledger. After the burial, they returned to their lives, which were not transformed by any single event. The plantation continued its work, the fields demanded their labor, seasons turned. Yet something had shifted in the currents of how people spoke of power and silence. Among the servants there existed a small constellation of memory. Names were kept alive by the telling of small guarded stories. Benedita's sketch of letters passed among children who would learn to read in secret. Tia Quiteria taught a young cousin some of the plant knowledge she had once been forced to use as a means of redress. They carried forward an oral history that would not fit into polite diaries or into the vested interests of those who managed the house. In the years that followed, whispers sometimes rose among outside visitors. Some in the town said that the heir's sudden death had been unfortunate. Others, darker-voiced, hinted that there were other reckoning that the house had not named. But these were murmurs, not investigations. The mechanisms that could compel a public accounting, the magistrates, the courts, a curious press, were not turned in the right direction for this household. No formal charge came from the town. No official search for truth ensued. The house's language, providence, illness, fate, sat like a cloak placed over the wound. That cloak protected powerful reputations. It also prevented the kind of conversation that might, in another world, allow for different remedies. The memory of what Rosa had done did not go out into the light as a virtue or sin to be judged by law. It stayed where it belonged, among the people who had lived with its weight. They were careful with it. Sometimes they told the story as a warning, sometimes as an explanation, sometimes as a quiet solace, that someone had acted when no tribunal would. The language of the telling never settled into simplistic terms. There were sharp-edged disagreements in the low rooms and under the fig tree. Some called the action murder and named the price of taking a life. Some called it retribution, a kind of makeshift justice in a world that made true justice impossible. For many, the act was a tangle of both. Those nuances mattered because they kept the story honest. To turn it into legend would be to smooth over the ribs and muscles of the hard moral question. To celebrate it without caution would be to erase the grief that produced the act in the first place. Rosa had not chosen to become an agent of death lightly. She had chosen because the other options had failed her. That truth is part of the story's moral edge. History, when it remembers, often prefers simple lines. Heroes on one side, villains on the other. But the life that had unfolded on Santa Rita Plantation was not satisfiable by such geometry. It contained contradictions and sorrow, a mother's fierce protection threaded through the cost of a human life. It held the knowledge that one action cannot fix the systems that made the harm possible. It taught that when institutions fail, ordinary people are sometimes forced into terrible choices that leave scars for generations. In the quarters, the story became a quiet manual for those who lived near its shadow. Benedita's letters taught children to shape letters of their own. Tia Quiteria's plants nourished the sick. Joaquim and Tobias arranged small defenses around the young ones. These were acts of living memory that did what a court could not. They kept certain names and lessons in the daily work, in the way the children were taught to look at a pot, in the way elders told the story without the fanfare that would make it dangerous. Years later, there were rumors that drifted in from towns farther away, whispers about changing times and new ideas carried like seeds on the wind. These were distant to the people of Santa Rita, and the plantation's daily life remained dominated by its own immediate needs. The story of Rosa and Benedita settled into a quiet place in the community's memory, a name said once, then passed on in a way that kept it from becoming a spectacle. If the tale demands a lesson, it is not an easy one. There is an argument to be made about righteous anger and the demand for justice. There is an opposite one about the sanctity of life and the moral consequences of taking it. The truth of Rosa's life sits somewhere between these poles, a place of mutual ignorance and partial comprehension. She did not make law, she answered what law refused to answer. She bore the cost of that answer alone. Others bore the cost with her in ways the world rarely accounts for. In the quiet of sleepless nights, in the folding of tender memories into the linen drawer, in the way children were taught to read in secret. In the end, what the story asks of those who listen is less about pronouncing a verdict and more about admitting that systems of power can and do leave desperate people with impossible options. It asks that we hold people's names as carefully as Rosa kept Benedita's letters, neither to sanctify the act nor to erase the sorrow that created it, but to remember why such an act moved from possibility to reality. Remembering does not absolve, nor does it condemn simply. Remembering is a way to keep a human life from being flattened into an illustration. Rosa and Benedita were human in the full sense, capable of tenderness, of pain, of failure, of action. They deserve to be known as more than a single event in a ledger. Their story calls us to look at the structures that make secrecy necessary, and to ask, in the quiet we can offer now, what changes would have been required to prevent the sequence of choices that led to the act. The last image that remains from Santa Rita is not a shout but a simple, intimate one. A pair of hands laid on the open letters of a young girl, a roof of fig leaves, a small plot of earth where two bodies lay together, marked only by a sprig of cassava. It is not triumphant. It is not triumphant because it refuses to be a victory. It is rather a mark of the unorderly work of grief and the imperfect measures of justice in a world where law sometimes protects the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. If this story stays with you, if it unsettles you, if it raises questions you cannot easily answer, write them down. Speak them in the quiet places. Remember names that history tried to bury. Share what remained with you in the comments. Hold them gently in your speech. Keep the memory of Rosa, Benedita, and Tia Quiteria as a small act of justice toward those who were denied one.